What's going on, everyone? How are we doing today? This is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit, and today we're going to be doing my first video of hopefully a very long series, and this is going to be all about combos and how to use combos in terms of hand reading and just how to understand combos a little bit better anyway, which will definitely help improve both your postflop and your preflop game. So before we get started, since this is my first video here, I figured I would do a little introduction so those of you who don't know who I am have a better idea of who you're working with. So as I said before, my name is James Sweeney. I go by SplitSuit or Split on 2+2, and I am author of Dynamic Full Ring Poker Beyond the Basics, which was released late last year in 2010. And I have been playing poker for, about 5 years now. I've been coaching poker for about 3, and in that time I've worked with about, give or take, a little more than 300 students at this point. So I've definitely done quite a bit of coaching, gotten very comfortable with it. I was a video maker over at Stocks for quite some time. I did about 25 videos over there. I am currently on the Card Runners roster as well, and I am hoping to have better WSOP results this year than I did last year. That way, who knows, maybe some of you who don't know me may actually see me on TV, so fingers crossed. But anyway, so getting right back into it. So what we're going to talk about today is combos. And combos are very, very useful. And they're useful because they allow us to put real backing and understanding to ranges. Now, for those of you who might not think in terms of ranges, what we mean is when we're hand reading, we're not trying to pinpoint our opponent on exactly one hand, because that's almost impossible to do. There's occasionally spots where we can do it, but most of the time we're working within a range. Our opponent probably has, the top 5% of his range, or maybe he has these logical hands, but I can't exactly pinpoint them on one versus the other. So combos are useful because they can give actual backing to that. If there's quite a few combos of one side or another of that range, then we can actually use that info to our advantage. So because we like to do everything in a very linear fashion when we're talking about poker, we're going to first start this video talking about preflop combos, both just the introduction, the basics of them, and then talk about weight, and then also show an example how we can use it in real time, that kind of stuff. And then after that, we're going to start talking about postflop combos. So again, basic intro to how many combos there are of this versus that, talk a little bit about weight, and then also go through a couple of postflop examples so you guys can actually see how this stuff is used. And if you already know this stuff, cool. Chances are you'll probably still take a little something out of this, so even if you feel you have combos decently understood, maybe you've read my concept of the week, maybe you've done some other reading, I still think you'll get something out of this. And this video will probably only be like half hour, 40 minutes, so I definitely suggest sitting through it, and I'll try to make it as graphically entertaining as possible as well. So sit back and let's get ready to start with some preflop combos. Alright, so just a rough intro to combos is understanding how many combos of different types of hands there are. So just real quick, there's effectively 3 or 4 different kind of hands we can have preflop. We can have paired hands, we can have unpaired hands, we can have suited hands, and we can have unsuited hands. Effectively, that's pretty much all we're dealing with. So when we look at something like pairs, say pocket pairs, there are 6 combos of each pair. So I'll flash them on the screen right here so you can see what I'm talking about. And so there's 6 of each different pair. And for unpaired hands, there are 16 combos. And just as importantly as how many there are of the unpaired, there are 12 unsuited, and there are going to be 4 suited combos. So the 4 suited combos, of course, are going to be XX of hearts, XX of clubs, XX of diamonds, XX of spades. So now we have a framework to work within. So one of the big things we want to think about when we're trying to talk about combos, and just as importantly talk about things like ranges, is talk a little bit about weight. If someone is opening deuces plus ace king, where is the weight of that range? Well, the range is obviously going to be very concentrated on pairs. But the second we start adding things like, say, ace queen plus, or ace jack plus, or maybe throw some king queen in there, very, very quickly we can start talking about the unpaired Broadway stuff has a lot of weight in that range, because there's 16 combos of each of those hands versus the 6 combos of pairs. So when we're looking at things like range, we want to think about where's the weight of that range. Is that range weighted towards weak stuff? Is that range weighted towards strong stuff? How is it going to react if we 3-bet? How is it going to react if we do X versus Y? So these are those things we constantly want to be thinking about. And we can get some of this if we look at things like EPPFR, for instance. So let's say our opponent raises 10% of hands from EP. So that means 10% of hands looks roughly like all pairs and some Broadway combos. So that range starts to become mildly weighted between pairs and unpaired. Now let's say our opponent only opened 5%. Now that range looks something like 7s plus and Ace King, which is a pretty snug range. And if we look at that, the weight of that definitely starts to favor a little bit more of the pair stuff. Especially if we say like a 7% open range, which is more like deuces plus Ace King, where definitely the pair stuff is going to be heavily weighted. So let's talk real quick about looking at weight and how we can use weight in an example. Okay, I don't know about you guys, but I tend to learn a little bit better when I do things in replayers and such when I'm talking about real hand examples rather than just trying to talk about them theoretically. So let's take a hand like this where we get an open and we're deciding whether or not we want to 3-bet. So let's just start talking a little bit about range and weight, and then we'll go into the example and start talking about that. So at this point, we always have to assign a range. So at this point, we can use things like stats. We can use default range of the level you're playing at, default range of the player type you're playing against, that kind of stuff. So let's just assign a range here of deuces plus, ace 10 plus, and king jack plus, which is generally a pretty fair open range for someone raising from MP, maybe a little bit on the looser side at a full ring table, but if you're running any sort of top of the tag spectrum, bottom of the lag spectrum, you're definitely opening these kind of hands most of the time, assuming that your left isn't completely terrible. So with that in mind, let's start breaking this range down and seeing what it looks like when we're talking about weight. So at this point, if we look at the pairs, deuces to aces, we're looking at 78 combos of hands. If we look at the suited combos, things like ace 10 suited, ace king suited, king queen suited, we're looking at 24 combos of hands. If we look at unsuited, things like ace jack off, ace queen off, king jack off, we're looking at 72 combos of hands. So if we look at it right here, we're giving our opponent an opening range of give or take around 174 combos of hands. Now, is the number 174 very important? Yes and no. It becomes important when we're doing math, and it's important that we have a basic idea of the number being 174, but when you're really playing, the chances of you very quickly saying, okay, he has 174 combos of hands, isn't really going to be something that you do, because it's just really difficult to do that. So what you really want to do is just have an inherent understanding and ballpark idea of these kind of things. And oftentimes you can get this just from like messing around with Poker Stove and basic combos for like an hour. You mess around with it just for a little bit till you have a really good innate understanding of this stuff, and that way it becomes more automatic when you're playing, so you don't have to sit there and count the combos on your hands, because that's just a massive waste of time. You just want to have a ballpark, inherent good idea, and then be able to go forward from there. Okay, so that's talking a little bit about that, and that's obviously important, but that's not the whole thing. We can't just look at someone's opening range and have much of a clue of what to do. So another thing we can look at is, say, like a C range. So what we just looked at was the O range, his original range of hands, and that was 174 combos. So I always like to look at something like a C range, the range of hands that he would continue with, because I like to see if I can get away with things like light 3-betting and other such things. So if we assign a C range, let's say something like 10s plus and ace king, which maybe is a little loose, maybe is a little tight. We'll just use it so we have some starting block to start with. So at this point, if we look at a range of 10s plus ace king, we're looking at 30 combos of paired hands, 10s plus, and we're looking at 16 combos of ace king, the unpaired stuff. So at this point, if we want to just get a strict idea on how often we thought he was going to fold, we would just take 100% minus 46 divided by 174. We're taking the amount of the hands he would continue with divided by the hands that he opened. 100% minus that number gives us a percent of how often we think he would fold. So at this point, we think he's folding give or take around, 73% of the time? I think it's 73.6, there it is. So at this point, we think he's folding a lot of the time, so actually, regardless of what our cards are, we can probably actually throw out a very profitable 3-bet here. And that's, of course, is always good for business and can always help us get a little bit of extra edge. But if we look at something like combos and blockers, then all of a sudden we can have a totally different understanding of this, and it can actually give more or less validity for going for things like light 3-bets and such. So let's go back to the classroom, talk a little bit about blockers, and then come back to this example and talk about how we can really use that to our advantage. Alright, so in case you've never heard about blockers before, when we talk about blockers, we're talking about having a card that makes it more or less difficult for our opponent to have other hands that relate to that card. So let's just take a quick example. Let's say that we have one of my favorite 3-betting hands, let's say ace-4 suited. Okay? So if we have ace-4 suited, we block quite a few combos of our opponent's hands. Having the 4 in our hand, we block out the amount of ways that he can make things like 5-4 suited if he's opening that, 3-4 suited if he's opening that, pocket 4s, which he's almost always opening. So that's good. So instead of our opponent having 6 combos of 4s, now all of a sudden he can only have 3 combos of 4s. We've knocked it in half, which is not the most important thing when we look at something like, say, our opponent having 4s, but it helps a lot when we look at the ace in our hand. So us having the ace in our hand blocks the amount of combos of our opponent having pocket aces from 6 down to 3. So we've knocked out half of his combos of the most powerful starting hand. That's good for us for sure. Another thing that we can look at is how it blocks out things like ace-king or ace-queen if he's opening that. So what we look at here when we're looking at blockers is let's take ace-king. So our opponent can start with 16 combos of ace-king, 12 unsuited, 4 suited. So if we take out one of the aces, now all of a sudden he's left with only 12 combos because we've knocked out one of the suited combos and we've knocked out 3 of the unsuited combos. So now this is fantastic. Now all of a sudden we've taken half of his most powerful hand away from the aces. We've taken a quarter of his ace-king away, which is one of his more powerful hands. And if we look at things like, remember we were talking about that C range earlier, if we're knocking out big pieces of that part of his range, we're probably getting a couple extra folds. And that's before we even look at the added equity of having ace-4 and, God forbid our opponent calls or whatever, calls our 3-bet, all of a sudden we have a hand that has a bit more equity. So we have all this good stuff coming from a blocker hand, and this is why ace-x hands are just fantastic for 3-betting. But you can also take the same rationale with a king, because you're blocking out combos of ace-king from 16 down to 12. You knock out combos of kings from, again, 6 down to 3. So you're taking these hands that are doing a lot of damage to his combos, and mind you, it does affect his opening combos, but more importantly, it affects his continuance combos, which is what we really care about, especially when we're looking at things like aggressive 3-betting, aggressive 4-betting, 5-bet shipping, things like that. So these are things that we can definitely use to our advantage. So let's go back to that hand and look and see how these kind of blockers can affect the EV of our plays. Alright, so let's go back to this example, the one where we were contemplating 3-betting, and say we actually do go for the 3-bet. So at this point, let's look at a couple different things. First of all, let's start looking at his O range, and let's assign him the same stuff we did last time. We think he's going to open deuces plus, ace-10 plus, king-jack plus, and we think if we 3-bet, he's going to continue with 10s plus and ace-king. Okay, so if remember from last time, we assigned, give or take around, what did we do, 78 combos of pairs, 24 combos of suited, and 72 combos of unsuited. So at this time, because we have the ace in our hand, which blocks out everything from ace-10 plus to pocket aces, and we have the 7, which blocks out pocket 7s. So now, if we look at his opening range, we're looking at a pair range of 72 combos, a suited range of 20 combos, and an unsuited range of 60 combos. So now instead of him opening that range he did last time of 174 combos of hands, now he's down to 152. and that's actually pretty dramatic. We've blocked out a significant amount of his hands, and it'd be even more impressive if our 7 were, say, like a jack, something that blocked out his ace-jack combos even further, his king-jack combos, things like that. Okay, so that's just something to consider, is how dramatic blockers can alter both his opening range and his C range. So if we look at his C range, and again we consider that he's going to that he's going to continue with 10s plus and ace king. Well, 10s plus now makes up 27 combos, down from 30, and the unpaired, the ace king, makes up 12 combos, down from 16. So now we've dramatically changed the amount of hands he can continue with, and thus we're going to change how often he's folding as well. So if we take that same formula, 100% minus 39 divided by 152, now all of a sudden we're getting a outright fold percentage of 74.3%, which is only up about a point from the other stuff. But if we run it through an EV equation, it actually has almost a, not quite, but almost a 10-cent difference. And a 10-cent difference is dramatic. I don't really know if you realize this, but given how thin edges are becoming, and mind you, not as much as at the pure micro stakes, but especially as you start working into small and medium stakes especially, the edges are just getting very, very thin. So anytime you can generate just a slight bit of extra edge, and here we're just looking at math, we're not looking at anything else really, it's very, very beneficial to your bottom line. Now, does this mean that I want to 3-bet everybody just because I have blockers? Good God, no. I still don't want to 3-bet people that don't have fold buttons. I don't want to 3-bet people that are going to open up their C range. If they're going to open up and start 4-betting more, and all of a sudden instead of folding, the large 74-ish% of the time, now all of a sudden they're only folding 50, that's not really good for me. Now all of a sudden I don't know if they're bluff 4-betting, I don't know if they're opening their value range, and maybe they're 4-betting 9s for quote-unquote value, I don't know. All I know is I don't want to face it. It's not something I don't really want to have to get 4-bet. I'm just looking here for outright folds. That's the real profit in this play, especially when I have something like blockers, or if I have extra ways I know I can win this pot. So again, looking at things like blockers, looking at combos, both in terms of the O range and the C range, can be vastly beneficial to our bottom line. And especially when we're trying to be more aggressive pre-flop, these are those little things that we can oftentimes look to inject into our game. And these are things that we can work on off the table very easily, and we should be working on them off the table. It should just be automatic. If person opens X range and continues with Y range, what kind of profit can I expect? And the whole thing is, it's really difficult to come up with an entire EV of the play, because what are you going to do when he calls? What are you going to do if he min 4-bets? What are you going to do if he calls and you catch top pair, or he calls and you miss, blah, blah, blah. So it's very difficult to come up with the entire EV, but if a play is outright EV, I'm really, really happy to take it as long as it's EV enough. If it's super thin and I could be wrong and the margin of error is against me, probably just going to err on the side of being a little bit tighter. But if the margin of error is especially in my favor, or if I just know it's a good plus EV play, no reason not to take it. So again, these are some things we want to be working on off the table, can dramatically benefit our bottom line. And again, it's all mathematical, very simple, and do a little bit of work with it and it will become something that is incredibly simple, and you're going to be able to use it in real time and create some extra profit, which is always nice. So let's stop talking about pre-flop. Let's go and talk about post-flop for a little bit and talk about how combos and blockers can be useful there as well. Okay, so let's start talking a little bit about post-flop combos and how we can use those to become better post-flop players. So just like with pre-flop, we can look at basic categories of post-flop combos. Let's just do that now. So let's just throw out a board and XYZ type board where every card is different, and look at how many things we can make on it. So if we're looking at things like pocket pairs and sets, if we look at an XYZ board, assuming that every single pocket pair is in our opponent's range by the time he got there, he could have 9 possible combos of sets, 3 of each one. So, and again, remember, each pocket pair number of combos from preflop is 6. So we have what we call the 6-3-1 rule. So if 6 combos of all the miss sets, 3 combos of all the hit sets, and if the board is paired, there's only 1 combo of that quads. Very simple. So that's the way that we like to look at sets. And again, this is why I think a lot of people start panicking post-flop and saying, oh no, there's a lot of sets that can be made. But really, if you look at it, there's generally not a ton of sets that can be made. So let's look at the next thing of single pairs. So let's say we're looking at top pair. What you do is let's say ace high board, we're trying to figure out how many combos of ace king our opponent can have. So what you do is you take the 4 unseen cards times the 3 unseen cards, and you have 12 combos. So if the board is king high, there's 4 unseen aces, there's 3 unseen kings now, 12 combos of top pair made with ace king. Very simple. And we can use that all the time, but we can also use that when we're looking at something like 2 pair. So let's say the board is ace king 7, and we're trying to figure out how many combos of ace king our opponent can have. Well, there's 3 unseen aces, there's 3 unseen kings, so there's 9 combos of 2 pairs. Very, very simple. And we can also look at things like flush draws. And flush draws are always a little bit weird, and I think people tend to overestimate how wide a flush draw range really is. Let's say our opponent preflop really only calls with something like ace king and ace queen of whatever suit, of his suited hands. So if the board is XXX, or we'll just give him a flush draw, there's club on board, whatever, then there are really only 2 combos you can have, ace king of it, ace queen of it. And also, if one of those cards is on board, possibly 0 if we look at things like blockers. So post-flop combos are very, very simple, and oftentimes it's just very easy multiplication. How many combos of, how many unseen of X card times how many unseen of Y card, you get an idea of how many combos you can have. And it gets a little bit more complicated when you look at entirety of range, but we can also use a program like Flopzilla to get a quick idea. So let's go through Flopzilla, talk about how to use it, and have some fun with that program. Alright, so let's introduce some of you guys to Flopzilla. If you have Flopzilla, I definitely suggest using it a lot. If you don't, I definitely suggest picking it up if you have a spare $15 lying around. Which reminds me, if you go to buy it, let him know that I sent you. He'll sell it to you for 15 versus 25. So, and I, just for the record, I don't get any kickback on that. That's just strictly a deal for you guys because I think it's a great program. I think most people should have it. So anyway, so this is the program. On the left, we have things like predetermined ranges that you can set and save. On the right, we have dead cards, and dead cards, obviously, for us, will just be our whole cards, but if you're playing, say, live, and some donk flips up his cards or whatever, you can always throw them in there, because they will affect things like combos and blockers. So let's just do something real quick inside here so we can see how to use it. So let's give our opponent some sort of, 12% range, give some sort of board, and let's see how to use this program. So really what we're looking at is it tells you how your opponent hits each of these given categories. So things like pocket pairs below top, and if you select it, it will show you what they are on the left, and also on the top left how many combos there are. So if you want to cheat, you can definitely use this to your advantage. I don't think you can use this program while you're playing. I don't think certain sites allow that, but again, this is something you do off the table just to get a really quick and ingrained understanding on how to look at, again, combos, blockers, that kind of stuff. So the big thing I like to look at here are things like flush draws and also how blockers affect certain things. So let's do something real quick. Let's give our opponent a 5% open range, put a flush draw on board, and look at some stuff. So at this point, what I want you to pay attention to right over here is the flush draw. Okay, so flush draw is 1.7%. I don't know about you, but I could really care less if someone has 1.7% of anything in their range, yet alone flush draws. Give them a slightly wider opening range. So flush draw actually did nothing. And also you notice why, because the ace-queen suited is blocked out by the queen on board. So now your opponent can no longer have ace-queen of clubs, so he can still only have ace-king of clubs exactly, given the range that we're assigning. Give him a slightly wider opening range. Now all of a sudden 2%. Give him an 18% opening range. Now all of a sudden it's roughly 3%. I don't know about you, but I could really care less about that. If you look down here, he does have a gut shot and flush draw for 0.7. So I don't know, let's round that up to like 3.5. Again, don't really care about that. 24% of hands. Now all of a sudden we're looking at some flush draws. So 7 and change, couple percent from down there. So we're talking about less than 10% of flush draws. Again, I don't know about you, but I could really care less about that. And just to get really crazy, let's just throw in every suited combo possible. We have 12% plus a couple combos from down here, like pair and flush draw. We're talking about maximum 15%. Again, I don't really panic about 15% of that. It's just not something to worry about. So those of you that really freak out when you see a flush draw on board, that's the standard thing to do. Most people do that, so you're not by your own in that thinking, but it's really not that correct because our opponents usually don't have massive amounts of flush draws, and we really shouldn't be that petrified of them. Now, obviously, if a flush draw fills and our opponent gets active, we should probably reconsider how much action we want to give there, but I really wouldn't suggest freaking out just because there's a flush draw on board and taking a line that maybe is not that good. Maybe it's quote unquote protecting against the flush draw, which is, in my opinion, a horrible reason. But let's just say it was. That's not really how we play good poker. We play good poker by maximizing against his range, not by protecting against a small sliver of our opponent's range. Okay, so that's my flush draw spiel. And then the other thing we can look at are things like combos. So let's give our opponent a tight opening range, deuces plus, ace queen plus. You notice that's roughly 8% of hands. Let's give him an ace high board and we'll see how our opponent hits. So what we notice up here are he has 3 different sets again, so it makes for 9 combos, 3 of each. And top pair, he has a lot of those. And it's just strictly because there's a heavier density on ace-x stuff. So let's say we throw in some of this stuff as well. Now all of a sudden that top pair density gets really high. But the second you start throwing in more things that dilute it, say like worse kings, now all of a sudden you notice that number starts tanking. So this is when I'm talking about weight, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So if we give him that 8% range back again, he's really hammering ace-x boards pretty hard, only because a lot of his range is ace-x, but also a lot of his range bricks, because he has 6 combos of deuces that whiffed, 6 combos of threes that whiffed, that kind of stuff. But you notice that if we look at how often he hits, if we look at just top pair plus, he's only hitting about a third of the time. That's pretty good for us. I mean, we can do a lot of aggressive attacking against him if he c-bets this board. If we think we can raise and get him to fold things like kings and unimproved eights and stuff, this can be a really nice board. Now we also have to look at things like blockers. So if we look over here at the dead cards, let's say that we give ourselves, pocket fives, sure. Notice that does definitely change things at least a little bit. Now all of a sudden we block out combos of hands that whiff for him, so that's something that we can definitely think about. And again, when I'm talking about attacking him, I'm only really attacking him if he's c-betting the entire range. If he's only c-betting 40% of the time, that really means he's c-betting pretty much the nuts, and in which case I really wouldn't be giving him much action. So the other thing we can use to our advantage when thinking about this, and just thinking in general, is talking a little bit about blockers. So if we give him this same range, this 8% range, and go over here and give ourselves something like, ace queen suited, sure. You'll notice his top pair percentage drops pretty dramatically. So drops from 25 down to 18. That's pretty dramatic. And one thing we want to think about here is when we have ace queen is we block out the amount of combos that he can make with top pairs. So if we go over here, hover, you notice his combos drop down to 14. And this is pretty important, and also why we should be kind of petrified when he starts getting really active, because we have the bottom of our value range. He beats us with ace king, he chops us with ace queen. There's nothing we can really be beating like ace jack or anything like that. So if he starts getting really aggressive on this board, we should kind of start panicking, just for the record, unless he's really kind of an aggro-tard. So again, this is the kind of way that I would use Flopzilla, is I run through different textures, I see how he tends to hit on them, I look at things like blockers, and again, blockers are very simple. If I have ace-x, and I say we take the same example, I have ace-queen, I'm trying to figure out how many combos of ace-king he has. Well, he has 2 unseen aces, and there's 4 unseen kings, so there's 8 combos of ace-king. If I'm trying to figure out how many combos of ace-queen he has, there are 2 unseen aces, there are 3 unseen queens, so 6 combos of that. Again, very, very simple. You're just taking unseen number times other unseen number and just multiplying them and getting a basic idea. And really the way that I like to use Flopzilla is start getting an idea on what weight does. So if I weight the pair part of his range and the board comes high, what does that do to him? If I weight the Broadway part of his range, say I give him this kind of stuff, and I put a low card board up, what does that really do to his range? Notice he's not hitting hardly anything. Over pairs, three of a kind, sorry. Say he continues with all those, he's really not hitting hard. Even if we give him every single pair, notice where most of his range is. Ace high, overcards, nothing, all that kind of junk. So this is the way that I like to use Flopzilla. Just get an inherent understanding of range and weight and that kind of stuff. What I would really suggest doing, get it, play with it for about, I don't know, half hour per day for 2 weeks. You'll probably never need it again unless you get into a really funky situation. You almost want your brain to be able to think like this. It should just be inherent, very easy, very straightforward, and you just know what to do. So again, suggest picking this up, and let's go start cranking through some other stuff, maybe some examples, and talk about how to use this stuff in real time. Alright, so let's look at a real example and see how we can use these blockers and these combos and stuff to our advantage. So let's take a hand where we steal from the cutoff with 9-7 suited, my favorite hand, get called by the small blind, and the small blind's just going to be a taggy dude, not a fish or anything, just your standard unimaginative tag. Board comes like that, he checks, and we decide to go for a c-bet. And the c-bet's pretty standard here. If we ran it through Flopzilla and give him a cold call range of, say, a lot of pairs, some Broadway combos like ace-king, ace-queen, ace-jack, king-queen, we're definitely getting folds at least half the time. And if we throw a half-pot c-bet out there, it only has to work a third, so probably making enough profit here to justify going for the c-bet. Plus, we always can double barrel occasionally and all that kind of fun stuff. And he ends up calling, which of course he's going to do sometimes, not shocking. We catch this, and we decide to go for a dub. So, we could look at the dub as far as, oh my god, we picked up equity, and don't get me wrong, equity is fantastic, I'm not complaining about it. But what I'm really saying here, if I'm going to go for a bet, is, okay, I think there's enough combos of things that will fold versus the combos that will never fold. So for instance, the combos that will never fold. 3 combos of deuces, 3 combos of fives, 3 combos of pocket eights. There are, say we give him ace, king, and king, queen in his opening range preflop. So we're talking about 12 of each of those, so 24. 24 plus the 9, we're talking about, 33 combos? So 33 combos of that. If I bet half pot, or say I bet anything less than pot, I need less than 50% folds. So let's just say I need 50% folds. I need him to have at least, say 16 combos of hands. So as long as I can come up with 16 combos of hands that would fold here, this is a pretty good dub. Assuming that I think he's folding things like 10s and jacks, this is really good. Assuming I think he's folding things like 4s, 3s, 6s, 7s, this is really good. Now, I also have to realize that I block out combos of pocket 9s and pocket 7s, which, of course, isn't really that good. But of all the other things, let's say he floats the flop with 3s, 4s, 6s, 7s, 9s, 10s, jacks, and I think he's going to fold most all of that. That's, remember, 6 combos for most all of those, more than enough to justify going for this bet. I mean, I only really need him to have 3 full of those and 3 full that will fold before I can go for this bet. And again, that's looking at this without even considering the equity that I have. I do have a gut shot, which is sweet, and if he calls here, chances are I can probably get a third bet off him when I hit, and chances are if he calls, he's probably the stronger side of his range given the assumptions that we're making. So going for a trip would probably be kind of bad unless we thought we could over bet it and get him to fold a king, which probably isn't happening. So again, it's very, very simple what we're looking for. How many combos of hands beat us or won't fold, so to speak, especially when we're looking at something like this where we are going for a bluff. So how many combos of hands won't fold, and then how many combos of hands can he logically fold, or will he logically fold? And if I have to make a slightly bigger bet in order to try to get something like 10s or jacks to fold, maybe I do it if I think it's still plus EV. So these are the big ways that we can use things like post-flop blockers, post-flop combos, and just get a better idea on whether or not we should be making dubs or not. I mean, let's say we thought our opponent would only call the flop with the top pair or better, then obviously a bet here is ridiculous because you're never getting that to fold unless for some odd reason you think he plays really oddly. So chances are, in a positional pot, your opponent's not going to fold top pair, but also chances are he's probably going to peel the flop a pinch wider than just top pair. So at least in this situation, you're repping real, the amount of combos he needs to fold aren't ginormous compared to how many he can logically continue with. But also, the entire equation starts to change. Let's say that we throw King Jack into our opponent's range, that he would call preflop, call the flop, and probably won't fold the turn. Now all of a sudden, instead of there only being, 33 combos of hands that won't fold, now all of a sudden if we add an extra 12 combos, now all of a sudden we're up to 45. Now we need to find almost 20-ish combos of hands to fold before we can really feel that great about our bet. I don't know about you, but I'm not really loving trying to find that. I mean, you need to find at least that. So I'm not really fist pumping trying to find that. So in that situation where I think there's more King X in his range, I'm probably not as likely to throw out this dub. Whereas the less King X, maybe I think he 3-bets Ace King, so I take that out of his range pre-flop. Maybe I think he 3-bets King Queen sometimes, take some of those combos out. So you see, when you look at the combos, you're just constantly in flux. How many combos do I think he has? How many combos do I think he has based on this texture? And more importantly, how many combos do I think I can get to fold? Because most of the time I'm bluffing, and most of the time I'm trying to get people to fold. Because I don't know about you, but I don't hit very many hands, so I need to find other more creative ways to try to make edge and profit. Again, very, very simple stuff. Doesn't really take too much time to get used to this kind of stuff. You just need to work on this stuff off the table, make sure it becomes automatic, and make sure it just becomes something that you can utilize in real time. If you can't utilize it in real time yet, don't go out there and start aggressively double barreling, because if you're going to start exposing a lot of your stack, you want to have a good idea on why and when to do it. You don't just push buttons for the hell of pushing buttons. Push buttons because you know they're plus EV buttons. Alright, so let's look at another 2 examples as well, so we can look at a couple different ways to look at this stuff. Alright, so let's look at another example. Let's say we open queens from the hijack and get called by the big blind, and we end up getting a board of a7-7 and he checks. And say we decide that we're going to go for a bet here. We think he's going to make enough mistakes, so we end up going for a little more than a half potter and just trying to get some value from our opponent. And say he ends up check raising. So at this point, what we're really should be asking ourselves is how many combos of hands beat us, and after that, how many combos of hands do what we think he would logically do this with. So in this situation, if we look at big hands, there is 1 combo of quads, again, pocket sevens. There are 3 combos of aces, but he probably 3-bets that pre-flop, so we can just pretty much take those out. And there's a couple combos of, say, 6-7, so 2 unseen 7s, 4 unseen 6s, so there's 8 combos of 6-7, 8 combos of 7-8 suited. I'm sorry, of 7-8 off. If you look at just the suited combos, then there are only going to be 2 combos of 6-7 and 2 combos of 8-7, because there's going to be 6-7 of spades and 6-7 of diamonds, same with 8-7. So again, it really depends on, do you think he's calling with offsuit combos or just suited combos post-flop? That can dramatically alter the way that you give him combos here. So let's assume that the big blind is a smart player, understands showdown value, and we don't think he would really check raise and turn something like, say, ace-jack or ace-queen or ace-king into a bluff here. Because if he does, he's really not getting called by much second best, maybe the occasional ace-jack or ace-queen, but probably not a tremendous amount of it. So if we don't think he would check raise an ace here, he's pretty much check raising 1 combo of pocket sevens, maybe a few combos of 6-7 and 8-7 suited, but that's if he even called with that preflop. Say we think he calls versus steals pretty tightly. All of a sudden, he's really repping nothing. So as long as I think he has some bluff potential, I'm probably going to be pretty likely to call this and intend on getting a little bit stickier post-flop, because I'm operating under the assumption that my opponent can't really have a big hand here, and thus has to have mostly bluffs, just given the assumptions that I've made both on his player type, his calling range, and the way that he would quote-unquote value check raise that flop. So this is a really, really easy situation where we can use combos to our advantage, looking at how he calls the open range preflop, looking at how he would value check raise the flop. For instance, against a fish, I would be petrified when they check raise that flop, because a fish will check raise ace-3 here. And it doesn't make any damn sense, but fish are fish, so we really can't be shocked about that. So I'm going to be a lot more scared against a fish check raising. But when a good player check raises, especially one who understands showdown value, who won't turn something like ace-jack into a bluff here, because again, that's effectively what the check raise does, then against him, I'm probably going to be more likely to get sticky, assuming I think he bluffs at all. Against a fish, I'm going to be more petrified. So again, using combos, using all the information you have available, and creating better lines based upon that is really what we want to use post-flop combos for. And again, it's really simple once you get some practice with it and go forward from there. Let's do one more hand as well, because I like the last hand that we have. Alright, so let's go over one last hand because I really like this example, and I think this one was a lot of fun when I originally played it. So I open from the cutoff, get called by the fish in the small blinds, go heads up, and catch second pair. So I go for a c-bet here, thinking that he'll probably call with some second best hands, everything from overcards to gut shots to any pocket pair, probably 3s through 8s type stuff. I mean, fish are fish. They're going to make those kind of mistakes a lot. So he calls, turn comes a 6, and he checks. So at this point, I decide to go for another value bet because he's a fish. He'll probably call with, again, enough second best stuff. He'll probably definitely call with, all the gut shots and stuff. And I think he'll call with ace high and stuff sometimes as well. And also, fish oftentimes love to do things like check raise top pair for no reason. So I actually think it slightly discounts the amount of hands that beat me that way. And also, if he had something like jacks plus, he probably 3-bets that preflop. So I'm just going for pure value bets against him. Now, obviously, if I face any resistance post-flop, I'll probably definitely reconsider the strength of my hand. But if he's just going to call, I'm definitely thinking that I'm good a very large percentage of the time. And then the 10 comes on the riv and he checks again. So at this point, it makes it incredibly difficult for him to have anything 10x. Because one, he didn't check raise it anything on the flop return, so it kind of discounts at that because he's a fish. And also now that the board paired with that 10, now it's even harder for him to have any 10x combos. So at this point, I just think I pretty much have the nuts, and it really just becomes a question of how big can I bet to get value. So I don't think he's going to love if I fire off here for like 23 and try to get value from worse 9s, 6, 7, that kind of stuff. So I actually go a little bit smaller, roughly around half pot. Try to get looked up by something like high card ace jack, or cry call 9, cry call 6, cry call 8s. And again, I really never think I'm behind, which definitely helps the equation. For instance, against a better player, I'd be really hard pressed to bet this because the combos of hands that would continue, I don't really do well against. If a good player isn't really going to call 3 streets here with anything that I beat. So oftentimes the bet against him would be kind of bad. But a bet against a fish like this can be purely for value because they get so sticky with just everything. So again, extra ways you can look at combos and also abuse players that either play too tightly or play too weakly or whatever it be. So again, post-flop combos are extremely simple and things that we want to use as much as possible when creating lines, when looking at the EV of certain plays, when thinking about value bets or bluffs or any of this kind of stuff. And we can also look at it when our opponent's betting into us. How many combos of real hands does he really have? Could I possibly check raise here because he's going to fold a ton of the time, that kind of stuff. For instance, I love to check raise aggressively on ace-high boards against people that c-bet 100% of their range because it's going to be really tough for them to continue. So those are those kind of things that I really like to attack. And again, a lot of this is off the table exercises you can do just so that it becomes automatic and you can just utilize this stuff in real time. You understand who to attack, how to attack, that kind of stuff. So again, hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you got some extra stuff out of it. Those of you that already knew some of this stuff, hopefully you found an extra application or two. That was obviously the main goal. And for those of you who this is an introduction to, hopefully you definitely get enough out of this. And I think if you spend some off the table time with it, you'll definitely benefit drastically from it. So again, hopefully you enjoyed it. If you come up with any questions or anything, don't hesitate to let me know. And if I can be of any help in the future, just give me a heads up. So hopefully you enjoyed the first vid. Hopefully I'll have another one out relatively soon, and then we can start working on some other aspects of our game. So again, hopefully you enjoyed. If you need anything, let me know. Otherwise, good luck out there and happy grinding.